On the night of March 20th, 1972, soul legend Curtis Mayfield has just finished another sold-out concert at the Palladium Theater in Los Angeles. Two young fans, Charles Alexander Foster and Robert Balow Jr., exit the venue and begin walking along Sunset Boulevard. 16-year-old Charles proudly displays his long black leather coat. Then a voice echoes in the night. "Hey man, man." Charles calls out in confusion. "Me?" "Yeah, what's up? And I like your coat." "Me too," Charles replies. The conversation between the young men, which begins with this innocent compliment about clothing, quickly turns into a robbery attempt, and within seconds, one of them will lie lifeless on the Sunset Boulevard sidewalk. This incident became known as the Hollywood leather jacket murder and deeply shook the people of Los Angeles. Until then, street gangs roaming South Central had not resorted to deadly violence. However, this murder brought their criminal activities to the center of public attention. Even more tragic, the senseless death of a young man over a leather coat ignited the longest and deadliest gang war in American history. This war was between the Bloods and the Crips. The Bloods and Crips are probably the two most well-known street gangs in the United States, and perhaps even the world. Both emerged within African American communities in Los Angeles. Today, the vast majority of their members are young black men, most under the age of 24. The distinctive clothing, colors, symbolism, and even walking styles used by their members have been adopted by many hip-hop artists who claim gang affiliations. For example, Lil Wayne, Cardi B, Jim Jones, DJ Quick, and producer Suge Knight have been associated with the Bloods, while Snoop Dogg, Eazy-E, MC Ite, and Ice-T were connected to the Crips. As a result, the legend and iconography of the Bloods and Crips permeated the music industry, films, and popular culture in general. When they were founded in the late 1960s and early 1970s, these gangs had at most a few dozen members and were completely concentrated in South Central Los Angeles. Over time, their numbers increased exponentially. They spread to America's East Coast and even abroad. Bloods and Crips' presence has been reported in countries like the United Kingdom, Jamaica, and Sierra Leone. To date, these two structures have brought in at least 50,000 members over 50 years. This was a tremendous number. Such a number brings to mind a massive and disciplined organization. But the truth is, neither the Bloods nor the Crips are centralized, rigidly organized structures. Members prefer to use the term set instead of gang. The Bloods and Crips are a collection of loosely connected small sets that share a common name, symbolism, and code of conduct. Even sets belonging to the same main structure don't have to be friends with each other. In fact, they can engage in deadly conflicts. Crip against Crip, Blood against Blood, for personal vendettas, profitable trade, or territorial control. But what truly makes the Bloods and Crips iconic is their decades-long rivalry. This gang war devastated the lives of countless young men and their families. According to the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center, at the height of this rivalry, 15 people were dying per day. PBS puts the total death toll at 15,000, while crime reporter Kevin Deutsch argues this number is at least 20,000. Considering there are approximately 50,000 total members, this points to an incredible death rate of around 40%. Journalist and author Michael Crearon describes this war as the sixth deadliest war in American history, after the Civil War, World War II, World War I, Vietnam, and Korea. But the truth is, none of these figures are definitive. It's nearly impossible to truly classify a death as a Crip killed by a Blood or vice versa. It's also extremely common for sets of the same affiliation to kill each other. Moreover, it's impossible to fully measure the impact of this war on African American communities, the families left behind, and the civilians living in these neighborhoods. But its impact is undeniably profound and devastating. Former gang members Donovan Simmons and Terry Moses documented this in their book, Bloods and Crips, Genesis of a Genocide. Every young person killed leaves behind a devastated family, a mourning mother. A quote from Simmons and Moses's poem, "The Truth is Us." Mothers cry at gravesides. Their children die before reaching 10th grade. The chance of a black child making it past 16 is extremely low these days.
But the broadest consequence of this impact is that gang conflicts have attracted the attention of authorities in a very, very harsh way. As we'll see shortly, this scrutiny led to entire neighborhoods being targeted indiscriminately, especially in the 1980s. Moreover, the presence of gangs and their violent activities naturally deter legitimate businesses from investing in or developing certain areas. When career options are very limited, young men and women either choose to move away from the area entirely or become more open to turning to a life of crime. Of course, this pattern is not unique to areas controlled by the Bloods and Crips. This conflict is only part of the broader gang phenomenon in the U.S. According to FBI data published in 2023, gang-related killings reached 422 deaths and became the second most common circumstance surrounding murders, after murders related to narcotic drug laws. As high as this number is, it was a major improvement compared to data published 10 years earlier. In 2013, the Department of Justice's National Youth Gang Survey reported a total of 2,363 gang murders. That's an average of 6.5 deaths per day. In the previous 5 years, the annual number of gang murders was not far from 2,000. As a result, from 2007 to 2013, nearly 12,000 people were killed by criminal sets on U.S. soil. Although only a portion of these victims were losses of the Bloods-Crips War, this particularly high death toll may be related to the revival of the hostility between them after a period of ceasefire. You see, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the two most bitter rivals in the American gang world had come quite close to achieving lasting peace. But before this interruption in the cycle of violence, we need to understand how this senseless carnage began. Now, the Crips and Bloods can trace part of their lineage back to early African-American youth gangs in Los Angeles in the 1920s and 30s. These gangs were small, loosely organized, and mostly consisted of childhood friends, brothers, and cousins who grew up together. They adopted names like the Goodlows, Magnificents, or Boozies. The main activity of these gangs was hanging out together or projecting a tough guy image rather than committing crimes or fighting each other. However, some groups, like the Boozies, were also involved in theft, fraud, and prostitution. By the 1940s, African-American gangs had grown in numbers and sophistication. They expanded their activities into more violent areas. Extortion and forced collection of protection money became fashionable during this period. Groups like the Purple Hearts or 31st Street sets expected local merchants to be strongly encouraged to pay protection money. In the 50s, more and more gangs emerged in LA, but this time they called themselves car clubs. This new generation of rowdy youth adopted names like Businessmen, Gladiators, Road Devils, Blood Alley, and became much more territorial compared to previous generations. If members of one car club were seen in another club's territory, the two sets would engage in all-out brawls in an empty lot. Fortunately, these types had not embraced deadly violence. They preferred to settle scores with bare-knuckle fights. Sometimes they resorted to close combat weapons, but never firearms. The late 1940s and early 1950s formed the backdrop for a larger social transformation in Los Angeles. Thousands of African-American families from all over the U.S. were moving to the City of Angels, finding work in local industry. Since most employers were concentrated in the southern half of the city, a large portion of families settled in South Central, and this became a predominantly African-American neighborhood. As we've thoroughly demonstrated in hundreds of videos, the past was the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. Los Angeles authorities were eager to prove this idea for the umpteenth time. Just a few years earlier, the U.S. had fought and defeated imperialist nations with racial supremacy ideology. Yet, in the 1950s, racial discrimination and segregation were still widespread throughout American society. This contradiction was embodied in William H. Parker, who was LA police chief from 1950 until his death in 1966. Parker complained to the press that African American families moving to LA were, quote, flooding an unprepared community. "We didn't ask for these people to come here." To make his stance on race perfectly clear, Parker refused to hire black officers in the LAPD, failed to investigate racist violence incidents, and the force became notorious for harassing or assaulting African Americans and Latinos found in predominantly white areas. Parker's era is remembered for widening the chasm between South Central youth and police forces. This state of hostility and distrust led to the formation of more street gangs in the 1960s. Initially, the purpose was to protect communities from abuse of authority. And this brings us to the origin story of the Crips, or rather one of many origin stories, because there are multiple narratives about how this gang came together and got its name. But all stories agree on who the founding members were: Raymond Washington and Stanley "Tookie" Williams. According to the most repeated narrative, in 1969, Raymond Washington, then 16, left the youth gang Avenues, of which he was a member, and formed a new crew, the Baby Avenues. This crew soon adopted the name Crips. According to Washington's intention, this group was supposed to fill the void left in African American communities after the Black Panther Party was weakened by the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. This itself is a quite dark story. We can definitely cover it at some point. Let us know in the comments if you'd like to see it. But essentially, Raymond's group was to be a self-defense and community support organization to protect South Central from harassment by authorities. In fact, according to former gang members, the name was actually an acronym of the phrase Community Resources for Independent People. However, Crips could also be an evolution of the word Cribs. This was a nickname given to the young members of the Baby Avenues. And there's another explanation for this strange name. Early members of Washington's set used fashion choices inspired by the Black Panthers, black leather jackets, and walking canes. It was because of these canes that the local press first referred to them as cripples or simply Crips. By 1971, Raymond Washington had somehow drifted from his original priorities. His Cribs, or Crips, were becoming targets not only of authorities, but also of more established street gangs. Washington formed an alliance with Stanley "Tookie" Williams, who was already running his own gang or set. In a single move, the Crips became a larger and more powerful structure compared to their more fragmented rivals in South Central. They reached a point of commanding respect and fear. Washington and Williams managed two separate spheres of influence. Washington was at the head of the East Side Crips, clustered around Fremont High School. The school's sports team official color was blue, therefore the Crips began adopting this color as a sign of belonging. Tookie, on the other hand, was at the head of the West Side Crips, in the area divided by the Harbor Freeway. In the early days of the Crips, the two leaders began incorporating smaller gangs. All these groups included the Crips brand identity in their names. Thus, names like 5 Do Crips, Rolling 20 Crips, etc. emerged. According to Princeton University sociologist Robert D. Flores, during this expansionist phase, the Crips abandoned their original self-defense and support purposes, and in practice became a criminal street gang, or more accurately, a loose collection of sets that terrorized its own neighborhood, engaged in illegal businesses, and applied violence to its rivals. And even if there were no rival gangs around, Crips subsets could be happy to fight each other. Violence could erupt from a real or perceived personal insult, or it was the result of tactical expansionism over profitable territories and criminal activities. Most often, violence was just a means. Sometimes the purpose was as ordinary as stealing someone's leather jacket. And now, let's return to our opening scene. On March 20th, 1972, shortly after Curtis Mayfield finished his concert, two people were roaming Sunset Boulevard: James "Cuz" Cunningham, 19, and Judson Bott, 22. Cuz noticed Charles Alexander Foster, Robert Ballo Jr., and a third friend walking along the boulevard. Cuz had noticed the black leather jacket or coat worn by one of the trio. Actually, it was a maxi coat that reached down to the ankles, the kind that looked incredibly cool, especially on someone like Richard Roundtree, star of the cult film Shaft.
Cuz simply said to Judson, "I want their coat." He approached the trio, and after the first brief conversation, Cuz told Charles to take off his coat. When Charles hesitated, Judson pulled out his .22 caliber pistol and snarled, "This is a robbery. Don't make me turn it into a murder." Apparently, Judson Bott didn't fire the weapon, but the confrontation turned into a violent fight where the two Crips attacked their younger victims with punches and kicks. In the end, Charles, the owner of the maxi coat, survived. The one who died was his friend, Robert Balow Jr. He was kicked and crushed by the gangsters until he was trampled to death. This was the first widely reported example of gang violence resulting in murder. The death of Robert Balow Jr. naturally alarmed authorities and the general public, but also small neighborhood gangs that now felt under pressure against the growing Crips threat. When a new major player becomes uncontrollably expansionist and aggressive in an area, it's common for smaller rivals to unite to balance it. The rise of the Crips triggered the same mechanism. The first seeds of anti-Crips opposition were planted by Sylvester Scott and Vincent Owens, founders of the Compton Pyrus, a small gang operating in the West Piru Street area. Scott and Owens were already in conflict with the Compton Crips, a Crip subset in the neighborhood. The Compton Pyrus were both very few in number and realized they were now facing an enemy that could resort to deadly violence. So Scott and Owens formed an alliance with other small gangs that felt threatened by the Crips. First, the Lord's Park Hustlers joined, then the LA Brims. More and more African-American youth groups in South Central joined this alliance. They united under a common flag. When they called each other, they addressed each other as Blood. The expansionism and unbridled violence of the Crips had thus accelerated the formation of the force that would oppose them for decades, the Bloods. Now that we know how the Crips and Bloods emerged, let's take a closer look at how they're organized, what activities they engage in, and their distinctive iconography and rituals. In terms of job description, both sets are in a similar line of work. Not surprisingly, their main sources of income are robbery, extortion, drug sales, and sex trafficking. According to former street soldier Tyrone White, 65 Menlo Crips faction, a child can be recruited into a set as young as 10, whether within the Crips or Bloods. A typical candidate is an African-American boy growing up in a single-parent household. Left to his own devices most of the day, this child hangs out on the street with older gang members ranging from 12 to 24 years old. If the child is liked or shows potential, he receives an offer to join the gang. To join, he must prove his worth. He must fight an established member. Sometimes the candidate is made to fight against 5 people at once. This initiation ritual inevitably ends with the child getting badly beaten. But what's important is not fighting skill, but earning respect. The new member then proves himself by defending his set's territory, fighting with rivals, or bringing in money through various illegal activities. Thus, he can rise in degrees of respect or authority. According to former members like Tyrone White, the Bloods and Crips are like a loose confederation rather than a parastate singular structure like the Italian Mafia or Yakuza. Each affiliated set controls a small territory. That's why authority positions are looser and there are fewer formal titles like in organized crime syndicates. Also, rank positions change frequently. Members get arrested, injured, killed, or leave the gang after a certain age, or when they achieve success through non-criminal means. Law enforcement can identify roles like president, vice president, treasurer, sergeant-at-arms, and enforcer within each gang. But according to former members, ranks are much simpler. Most gangsters are called Little Homie or Big Homie according to their age and experience. A big homie who proves himself can be recognized by his peers as an OG or even double OG. Quote from Tyrone White, "A double OG is generally one of the big homies who's done more than you can imagine. He's done everything. He's killed, robbed, made money, been to prison. Whatever comes to your mind, he's done it." So OGs and double OGs form the leadership of each set. Because they've done everything, they can delegate the most violent part of their activities to enforcers called street soldiers. Let's quote again. "A street soldier is exactly what it sounds like. A street soldier will go and do that job for the OG, for the double OG. A street soldier has no limits. He does whatever it takes at any cost." The most distinctive thing that separates the Crips and Bloods from each other is an extensive set of clothing, slang, and other iconography popularized by films and especially hip-hop.
The most obvious element is color choice. The Crips have chosen blue as their flag color, so they can be seen with blue bandanas, blue belts, blue tops, and Chicago White Sox blue caps. In footwear, they prefer British Knights and K-Swiss brands. This preference is not about quality, it's entirely about brand association. BK in the British Knights logo is taken to mean blood killers. K-Swiss is reinterpreted as kill slobs when I see some. Slobs, an insult directed at bloods. The Crips' instinctive hatred of their rivals extends even to the letters they use. A real Crip avoids saying words beginning with B, his rival's letter, and uses C instead of B. So if someone is going to eat a burger, they ask for a Kurger instead of burger. Members carry many symbols, such as gestures, tattoos, signs, and attitudes. For example, a kind of dance routine called Crip Walk that was popularized by celebrities like Ice Cube and Serena Williams. Crips address each other as cuz, from cousin, and tattoo themselves with the six-pointed star, Star of David, or other symbols referencing the number 6. It's not entirely clear why the six-pointed star was chosen, but it may have been adopted after connections were established with a gang alliance called Folk Nation, based in Chicago. This group was a structure co-founded by David Barksdale, also known as King David. In reaction to the Crips' use of this symbol, the Bloods have adopted the five-pointed star and references to the number 5 in general. To differentiate themselves from their enemies, the Bloods' wardrobe is full of red clothing, for example Boston Red Sox caps. The origin of this choice may come from the sports colors of LA Centennial High School, a center where early Bloods grew up. Just like the Crips, the Bloods also have their own walk-like dances, complex hand signs, favorite bandanas, and a special intolerance toward a particular letter. Bloods use B instead of C whenever possible, unless they're wearing Calvin Klein, because they interpret CK as Crip Killer. It took time for both factions to establish what could be called a uniform clothing system, but the hostility was there from the very beginning. From 1972 to 1979, the Crips and Bloods grew in numbers. But this doesn't mean each affiliated set grew in manpower. On the contrary, each set was relatively small. There were just more sets, and they were scattered throughout Los Angeles. In other words, Los Angeles was not a battlefield where two large blocks faced each other along a clear front line. The city became the scene of countless turf wars where numerous small gangs scattered and dozens of murders were committed. This wasn't just one feud, it was a fractal explosion of feuds, divided into numerous small wars that lasted years. In South Los Angeles alone, 450 people died due to gang violence between 1972 and 1979. Most of these deaths stemmed from Bloods-Crips conflicts. During this period, Crips founder Raymond Washington began to become disillusioned with what he had created. Washington was always against guns. He preferred to settle scores with fistfights. But after being arrested for robbery in 1974, he lost control over the gang. The structure irreversibly fragmented, loosened, and became prone to deadly violence. Washington was released in 1976 and got to work with a clear agenda: to centralize control over Crips sets and establish a ceasefire with the Bloods. However, he made little progress. His partner, Tookie Williams, couldn't help much either, as he developed an addiction to PCP, known as angel dust. In any case, by the end of 1979, both founders would have exited the scene. In February and March, Williams carried out 2 violent robberies and killed 4 people in the process. He was caught in 1981 and sentenced to death. The sentence was executed in 2005. Washington was killed in a drive-by attack on August 9, 1979. The murder remains unsolved to this day. By the early 1980s, the Bloods-Crips war was completely out of control. The decline in the automotive sector in Los Angeles led to high unemployment and provided gangs with more new members. At the beginning of the decade, total membership had reached approximately 30,000 young men. This increase coincided with the emergence of crack cocaine. This was an extremely profitable trade. The Bloods and Crips jumped on this opportunity and contributed to a real addiction epidemic within their own communities. Now, larger armies were competing for control over open-air drug markets and distribution routes, which inevitably raised murder rates. As big as Los Angeles was, it was ultimately a single city, and the old cliché says this city wasn't big enough for two gangs. So, throughout the 80s, Bloods and Crips members carried the drug trade across the U.S. They established affiliated sets or developed alliances with already existing gangs in places as far as the East Coast. As they expanded their business and influence outside California, they also exported their forms of violence. Most of the conflicts and murders were naturally related to the drug trade. However, they weren't often professional executions planned to gain business advantage. According to narratives from former members, like former Blood Skip Townsend, deadly violence was chaotic, improvised, and unpredictable. A quote from him, "Most shootings are emotional. Someone being with someone's girlfriend, someone stealing someone's car, someone getting beaten up at a mall, and now they know they're going to be at the skating rink tonight. Gang wars weren't like guys sitting at a table strategizing who are we going to hit next." Los Angeles police forces began comprehensive programs to reduce gang violence as early as 1979. These operations were as ineffective as they were brutal and reinforced distrust of authorities instead of steering African American youth from criminal life. The first specialized operation was the Operation Safe Streets program, launched by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department in 1979. OSS included teams in the prosecutor's office and a gang supervision program in the probation department. But its backbone was a task force of specially assigned officers who would become notorious for harassing black youth as gang members without evidence. OSS was followed by a program developed by LAPD Chief Daryl Gates, CRASH, Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums. By Gates's own admission, his preferred name would be Total Resources Against Street Hoodlums, which of course would abbreviate to TRASH. Quote from Gates, "We tried to call it trash to demean gang activity, but some activists objected. They said it was inappropriate because we were dealing with people. It was unseemly to call our units trash."
Officers on crash teams employed controversial tactics. For example, according to the Los Angeles Times, they would kidnap Crips or Bloods members and drop them off in rival territory. Or, before and during the 1984 Olympics, Gates had crash teams carry out large-scale mass arrests. This approach remained Crash's signature tactic and peaked in 1986 with Operation Hammer. For 6 months, the LAPD effectively besieged and occupied South Central. 1,453 people were arrested. About 90% of them were later released without charges. LA city and county officials were very eager to fund programs like OSS and CRASH. At the same time, they were equally willing to cut funding for less warrior projects designed to steer youth away from gang life. According to the Los Angeles Times, some youth gang counselors were fired, so the LAPD could hire more gang specialist detectives. Meanwhile, the Bloods-Crips war continued unabated, and may even have been further inflamed by the authorities' repressive strategies. The general public, inside and outside LA, was aware of the war between the two gangs, but the perception was this: violence wouldn't involve ordinary citizens. This perception changed on January 30th, 1988. That day, 24-year-old graphic artist Karate Kalima was caught in the crossfire of a conflict between rival sets. The war had spilled outside the gang world and began hitting civilians. In response, Chief Gates increased his activities and carried out more mass arrests under the name Crash. According to former officer Don Jackson, mass raids were conducted from 1987 to 1990. In 1 year, 50,000 people were detained. No charges could be pursued against the vast majority of them. There was no significant decrease in crime rates. Quote from Jackson, "So it was a massive denial of constitutional and civil rights. They've continued such raids since then." During the same period, the LAPD faced more than 2,600 allegations of excessive use of force made by private citizens.
These allegations led to investigations of 1,400 officers. Less than 1% of them were prosecuted. The tension between Los Angeles and the police department finally exploded on April 29, 1992. That day, 4 LAPD officers accused of brutally beating African-American citizen Rodney King were acquitted, despite the incident being caught on camera. Just hours after the acquittal was announced, thousands of people, mostly African-American and Latino, poured into the streets. The LA riots continued until May 4th. They resulted in 6,000 arrests, more than 2,000 injuries, and a death toll of 63 people. While national and international media narrated the Battle of Los Angeles, they missed another turning point happening simultaneously. Bloods and Crips representatives had met in the Watts area to bring a ceasefire to their 2-decade war. The Watts ceasefire was later interpreted as a reaction to the brutal assault on Rodney King. According to that interpretation, the Bloods and Crips had united to loot the city and fight together against the LAPD. The truth is, the ceasefire was agreed upon on April 28th, one day before the acquittal verdict, and peace negotiations had been ongoing since 1988. The person who had been steadily leading this process was Aquila Sherrills, a former Grape Street Crip. Sherrills had been influenced by the works of civil rights writers like Malcolm X and James Baldwin. This influence gave him the courage and language to talk about what was happening in the neighborhood. At one point during that period, Sherrills was able to convince some Crips members that they needed to stop their senseless massacre. Aquila then turned to the Bloods faction. Initially, he met with expected resistance. Skip Townsend, whom we quoted earlier, was among those who initially opposed the idea of shaking hands with the enemy. But Skip, like many others, realized they were living in a constant state of underlying tension and fear. In his own words, "I couldn't even get gas. I couldn't go grocery shopping. I couldn't do anything. I was either going to encounter someone who wanted to harm me, or I was going to have to harm someone." After months of preparation, Aquila Sherrills' efforts brought about the 1992 Watts ceasefire. This ceasefire was formalized in 1994 with a written treaty modeled after the 1949 peace agreement signed between Israel and Egypt. The Bloods and Crips thus reached a state of peace, and violent gang crime dropped sharply in the Watts area. However, according to LAPD reports, the two factions were still fighting and killing in other parts of the city. From May to August 1992, police recorded 24 murders involving the Bloods or Crips. 9 of these were directly related to the rivalry. This data showed a sharp decrease compared to previous years, but it also proved that not all affiliated sets were adhering to the ceasefire. As we said before, we'll say again, the Bloods and Crips are not a centralized syndicate. Therefore, individual sets may not feel bound by the terms of the 1994 treaty. Moreover, even those who supported the ceasefire became disillusioned over time.
The decline in crime rates had encouraged local authorities and private investors to promise a $6 billion investment to rebuild and improve poor neighborhoods. The plan would create 74,000 jobs over 5 years. This raised hope for a more prosperous future away from crime. However, this plan never materialized. With few options remaining, many young men in Watts, South Central, and other areas continued to turn to gang life. As the ceasefire came into effect, the Bloods-Crips rivalry literally exploded in popular culture. Large audiences first became familiar with the conflict through Dennis Hopper's 1988 film Colors. In the film, Robert Duvall and Sean Penn played 2 CRA-ish police officers. John Singleton and the Hughes brothers reflected the gang members' perspective in the films Boys in the Hood, 1991, and Menace II Society, 1993. But the medium that most widely spread the image and legend of South Central Bloods and Crips was undoubtedly hip-hop music, and especially gangster rap. As mentioned earlier, many artists in the genre were connected to one of the two gangs. This led to the rivalry being reflected in typical rap beefs, sometimes turning into deadly violence. The mother of all beefs may be the hostility between producer Suge Knight and his Death Row Records and Sean Combs, Diddy, and Bad Boy Entertainment.
Although neither side had members in the full sense, Knight was associated with the Bloods, while Combs was associated with the Crips. In 1995, Death Row and Bad Boy added another layer to the conflict by declaring the East Coast-West Coast War. Most shots were figuratively fired with aggressive lyrics in diss tracks. But this beef quickly turned into real violence and resulted in the killing of two hip-hop superstars, Death Row's Tupac Shakur and Bad Boy's The Notorious B.I.G. According to former homicide detective Robert Ladd, the event that triggered the process leading to Shakur's death occurred in 1996. Someone named Orlando Anderson from Southside Crips attacked and robbed one of Suge Knight's bodyguards. This assault was followed by a violent 10-day conflict in Compton. Southside Crips faced off against Mob Piru Bloods. On September 7, 1996, in Las Vegas, Tupac Shakur saw Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand Casino. As revenge for the robbery of Knight's bodyguard, Shakur went up to the Crip and punched him in the middle of his face. Both sides' entourages got involved in the incident and a fight broke out. Hours later, as Tupac and Suge Knight were heading to a nightclub, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside their car. Someone in the Cadillac opened fire and killed 25-year-old Tupac Shakur. 6 months later, on March 9, 1997, the once friend, then rival Notorious B.I.G. was also killed in a drive-by attack. The murder was unsolved, but it's thought to possibly be connected to Tupac's killing and the Bloods-Crips rivalry. As for Tupac's shooting, in September 2023, Las Vegas police arrested someone named Dwayne Keefe D. and charged him with the rapper's murder. The suspect was a major figure within the Southside Crips and was also Orlando Anderson's uncle. Meanwhile, Orlando Anderson was also killed on May 29, 1998, in a conflict with a rival Crip set. As this chapter was being prepared, Dwayne Davis had not yet been tried, so the final chapter of this multi-layered rivalry has not yet been fully written. In the early 2000s, the Watts ceasefire achieved through Aquila Sherrill's mediation began to unravel. In 2004, Sherrill's 18-year-old son, Terrell, was killed. Characteristically, Sherrills did not pursue revenge or retaliation. He told the Forgiveness Project, "I choose to have valuable conversations with the community about why revenge doesn't work. I say that Terrell's killer is also a victim of a culture devoid of compassion. You can only kill someone if your heart has become calloused. That's why I want to know why this young person's heart became so calloused. It's not enough to catch him and throw him aside." The Gospel of Peace was also preached by Stanley Tukey Williams, one of the founders of the Crips, while awaiting execution at San Quentin Prison. There, he prepared a directive called Protocol for Peace. It contained rules on how youth gangs could make peace agreements. After successfully testing it with prison gangs, he took it outside. According to The Guardian, in 2005, Williams' protocol was used by 2 warring gangs in New Jersey and reduced 34 gang murders per quarter to 0. That same year, numerous calls were made to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger to commute Williams' sentence. The governor rejected all requests, and Stanley Williams was executed by lethal injection on December 13, 2005.
Violence returned to Watts in full force at the end of 2005. Brendan Bullard from the Grape Street Crips was shot in the face on Christmas morning. Less than an hour later, a member of the rival Bounty Hunter Bloods was shot and killed. This was followed by 20 conflicts with a total of 8 people killed. By the early 2010s, gang-to-gang violence was once again widespread across the U.S. In 2013, there was an average of 6.5 deaths per day. According to LA gang expert Alex Alonso, the spirit of the Watts ceasefire had completely faded by the mid-2000s. Joining a gang was still attractive to young men with little economic hope or seeking an artificial family. As Alonso said, the gang's identity is more important to them, and fighting for that identity is consuming them. But as the war rose again, authorities seemed to have found the right tactics. After the 2005 and 2006 Watts conflicts, council member Janice Hahn established the Watts Gang Task Force together with LAPD and local community representatives. This structure brought together police, faith leaders, families of gang members, and sometimes even Bloods and Crips members themselves.
In weekly meetings, ongoing rivalries were discussed, community grievances were addressed, and generally tension was reduced in an effort to prevent new murders. This approach was successful and ushered in a new era where the LAPD turned to communication and cooperation with African American neighborhood residents instead of the crash program's military occupation-like tactics. LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa took it a step further and allocated an annual budget of $21 million to the Gang Reduction and Youth Development Program. This included funding for gang mediators and additional services for schools with high gang presence. In more recent years, various Bloods and Crips sets across the U.S. have contributed to reducing violence. They showed that war isn't the only way of life for youth wearing blue or red. When appropriate opportunities arose, gangs were willing to shake hands on a temporary ceasefire. For example, in 2015, Bloods and Crips in Baltimore declared a ceasefire after Freddie Gray was killed while in police custody. Gray's death was followed by a month of protests and riots. However, according to the Los Angeles Daily News, the agreement signed by the gang stated no member will participate in looting or rioting. In July 2016, Bloods and Crips in Atlanta took to the streets with Black Lives Matter protesters. The goal was to demand justice for Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, who were killed by police. In April 2019, Bloods and Crips in the Crenshaw area of South Los Angeles initiated ceasefire negotiations. The event that triggered this initiative was the killing of rapper Ermias Ashkadum, Nipsey Hussle. Ashkadum was a former member of the Rolling 60s Crips, but his death was also mourned by local Bloods. Rivals came together to mourn in his memory and planned a ceasefire. Shamond Bennett from the Rolling 60s Crips told the Los Angeles Times, "We're going to continue what Nipsey wanted, what he tried to preach in his songs. There's no point in fighting for a block you don't own." In May and June 2020, Bloods and Crips in Houston once again marched shoulder to shoulder to protest the death of George Floyd. And in the COVID-19 emergency and lockdown period, Bloods and Crips sets in Allentown, Pennsylvania and South Los Angeles mobilized to support their communities. Gang members in Allentown came together and organized free diaper distribution to 1,100 families. In LA, wearing red or blue masks, they walked the streets and encouraged other citizens to vote because their criminal records prevented them from voting. You may have noticed a pattern. When a community is shaken by an urgent situation, mourning a sudden loss, or protesting police violence, Bloods and Crips members of that community can be ready to set aside their hostilities and provide support. However, recent ceasefires aren't limited to such events. Sometimes they can also occur through an individual's initiative. Skip Townsend, the Bloods leader who first opposed then joined the 1992 Watts ceasefire mentioned earlier, implemented a simple plan in February 2022 to end the war between two specific sets. He invited the Rolling 60s Crips and Inglewood family Bloods to brunch and paid the $286 bill. Townsend got the rivals talking over salmon bagels and Bloody Marys. The Rolling 60s and Inglewood family got to know each other through this conversation and agreed to respect one another. In Skip's words, "Those who wear blue, those who wear red, it's important that they know each other and build relationships to stop the violence." Speaking to the Los Angeles Times in June 2024, Townsend said there hadn't been a single murder since that brunch. "We too would like to think in a perfect world, every rivalry, every feud, every war could be resolved with a simple meal and conversation. But of course, we're aware the world isn't perfect. It could be years, even decades, before the last Blood or Crip victim falls to this senseless carnage. Still, the numbers are hopeful. In 2013, 45 people per week were dying from gang-related violence. 10 years later, that number had dropped to 8. Of course, 8 is still too many, but in the last 20 years, Bloods and Crips in America have repeatedly shown they can be willing to talk with each other and even with authorities. They're looking for an alternative to exit the cycle of violence, an alternative to the state of constant conflict, a perpetual machine of pain where every body clothed in red or blue feeds the rage that will destroy the next life. To close today, we want to quote from another poem by Donovan Simmons and Terry Moses, Teardrops and Closed Caskets. The poem describes a mother mourning her killed son. The mother asks, "Why did my son have to die?" The boy's gang friends say his death will be avenged, an eye for an eye, someone else must die. But the mother finds no solace in the endless cycle of revenge.
When she looks to the future, she can't find any justification, so the only thing she can see is another mother crying.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to share, like, and subscribe.